Summer 1987, Bagram Air Base perimeter, Afghanistan. The low hum of the flat-face acquisition radar is a constant companion. It pulses into the thin mountain air, a mechanical heartbeat scanning the deep blue Afghan sky. Inside the cramped ZIL-131 truck cabin, a young Soviet technician monitors the green, swirling glow of his scope. Dust cakes the windshield. Outside, the launchers of the 2K-12 Cub, NATO-coded SA-6 Gainful, point skyward, their 3 missiles, each a silent promise of destruction. For months, this site has been a fortress, a guardian of the strategic airfield. The Mujahideen have no aircraft. The threat, they believe, is purely theoretical. Then, a new tone shrieks from the warning receiver. It's not the slow beep of a helicopter's radar, not the familiar signature of a friendly MiG. This is a raw, piercing screech, a frequency-agile nightmare descending at over Mach 2. The technician's eyes widen. His screen is a storm of strobe lines. The radar's own emissions have become a beacon. A death sentence. Something has locked onto them. Not their target. Them. He slams his palm on the general alarm. Soldiers scramble from their tents, looking skyward, seeing nothing but contrails. The radar operator yanks at power switches. The humming pulse dies. The screen goes dark. An eerie silence falls, broken only by the wind. But it is too late. The missile is not looking for a plane. It is following the ghost of their own radar signal, a path already burned into the ether. It does not need to see them anymore. It remembers. High above, a silver dart, unmarked and unseen, completes its terminal dive. The final connection is not radar to target. It is emitter to hunter. A new rule of war has just been written in fire and shattered steel on a barren hillside north of Kabul. The era of sanctuary was over. To understand the shock of that moment in 1987, one must first comprehend the sanctuary the Soviet Union had built in the Afghan skies. The initial invasion of December 1979 was a masterclass in airborne and mechanized assault. Regiments of the 105th Guards Airborne Division descended on Kabul, while the 40th Army's columns ground across the Amu Darya River bridges. Air supremacy was not an objective, it was a given. The Democratic Republic of Afghanistan's DRA Air Force was negligible, and the insurgent groups, collectively known as the Mujahideen, possessed nothing more threatening than heavy machine guns and RPGs. The sky belonged to Moscow. This dominance was institutionalized and hardened over the first half of the 1980s. Soviet military doctrine, forged in the Cold War crucible of a potential NATO confrontation, was built around layered, integrated air defense. In Afghanistan, this doctrine was adapted to a counterinsurgency role. Key strategic points, major airfields like Bagram and Kandahar, the Salang Pass Tunnel, large garrison cities, were ringed by sophisticated surface-to-air missile SAM sites. These were not the massive, strategic SA-5 batteries of the Soviet homeland, but tactical systems. The mobile SA-6 Gainful, the tracked SA-8 Gecko, the ubiquitous SA-13 Gopher, and the shoulder-fired SA-7 Grail. They were networked with radar-directed anti-aircraft artillery AAA, most notably the ZSU-23-4 Shilka, a devastatingly effective quadruple-barreled system. This network served a dual, brutal purpose. First, it was a defensive shield, a bubble over Soviet strongholds theoretically immune to any aerial threat. This allowed for the secure buildup of logistics and the safe transit of high-value aircraft like Command and Control IL-76 and AN-12 transports. Second, and more critically for the war effort, it protected the Soviets' primary weapon of strategic influence, its attack aviation. The war on the ground had quickly stalemated. The Mujahideen refused to engage in set-piece battles, melting into the endless mountains and villages. In response, Soviet commanders turned to overwhelming aerial firepower to compensate. Squadrons of Su-25 Grach, Frogfoot, ground attack aircraft, Mi-24 Hind attack helicopters, and older but potent MiG-21s and Su-17s became the hammer of the 40th Army. They conducted reconnaissance, provided close air support for beleaguered convoys, and executed free hunt missions in contested valleys. The SAM and Tupoye shield around their bases ensured these aircraft could launch, recover, and rearm in near total safety. For a Soviet pilot, the war was dangerous over the Hindu Kush, but the journey home meant a return to a secure umbrella. By 1984 to 85, this system faced its first serious challenge. The Mujahideen were learning. Through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, and funded and equipped by a coalition led by the United States CIA, Saudi Arabia, and China, they began receiving more sophisticated weaponry. The first major game-changer was the British-made blowpipe, and later the American FIM-43 Red Eye, early manpads, man-portable air defense systems. These weapons were crude, susceptible to countermeasures, and had limited success rates, but they introduced a new, chilling variable: the possibility of a strike from any ridgeline at any time. Soviet aviation tactics began to shift, flying higher and faster, reducing their loiter time and accuracy. The sanctuary was being challenged but not breached. The psychological and tactical cornerstone of Soviet air operations remained their radar-directed SAMs. A crewman on an SA-6 or SA-8 site was not just a defender, he was a symbol of inviolable technological superiority. His radar's active pulse was an assertion of control. He was the hunter scanning the skies for prey. The notion that his own search beam could be transformed into a homing beacon for a weapon he could not see, outrun, or outmaneuver was a vulnerability his doctrine had never seriously contemplated. It was a blind spot engineered in an era of symmetric warfare, now exposed in the asymmetric crucible of Afghanistan. The stage was set not for a battle of bombs, but of signals. A silent, electronic duel where the winner would be determined not by courage or numbers, but by who could see and hide in the invisible spectrum of radiation. The Mujahideen's acquisition of early manpads was a warning shot, but not a decisive shift. Soviet pilots adapted with flare dispensers, evasive maneuvers, and higher operational altitudes. The real strategic crisis for Moscow emerged from a different vector entirely: the Stinger. In the spring of 1986, the first batches of American FM-92 Stinger missiles began to filter across the Pakistani border into the hands of Afghan rebels. The Stinger was a generational leap. Its advanced seeker head could reject most flares, its speed was terrifying, and its ease of use, relative to earlier systems, was revolutionary. The impact was immediate and visceral. Soviet and DRA helicopter and fixed-wing loss rates spiked dramatically in the latter half of 1986 and into 1987. The Hind, once the terrifying overlord of the valleys, became a vulnerable target. This presented the United States with both a triumph and a dilemma. The Stinger was a spectacularly successful covert action, proving the power of precision weaponry in the hands of insurgents. But it also revealed the limitations of a purely defensive strategy for the Mujahideen. The Stinger was a reactive weapon. It could punish Soviet air power when it ventured out, but it could not strike at the heart of the Soviet system. It could not reach into the protected sanctuaries of the air bases. The Mujahideen still had no answer to the radar-directed SAM and Nusaypoy umbrellas that shielded these hubs of Soviet military power. As long as those umbrellas existed, Soviet aviation retained a secure base from which to operate, to regroup, and to dictate the tempo of air operations, even under the Stinger threat. Needed a weapon that could perform a specific, high-tech mission: SEAD-A, suppression of enemy air defenses. In NATO doctrine, SEAD was the critical first step in any air campaign. Before bombers could strike, specialized aircraft had to blind and destroy the enemy's integrated air defense system. The quintessential weapon for this role was the AGM-88 High-Speed Anti-Radiation Missile, or HARM. Designed by Texas Instruments, the HARM was a masterpiece of malicious logic. Once fired, its broadband seeker head would listen for the electronic emissions of enemy radar, surface-to-air missile guidance systems, acquisition radars, even HUS-A fire control radars. It would then lock onto that emission and follow it to its source at over twice the speed of sound, destroying the radar and, by extension, the system it guided. It was a weapon that turned a defender's primary sense, his radar, into a suicidal liability. But there was a profound problem: Navy and Air Force asset. Military aircraft in Afghanistan would be an act of open, direct war against the Soviet Union, with incalculable escalatory risks. The CIA's covert action program, however, provided a potential pathway. Navy devised an audacious plan. They would modify a carrier-capable aircraft, the Grumman A-6E Intruder, for a one-way, deniable mission. markings and operating from a concealed forward location would be flown by a covert crew to launch the HARM against a pre-identified Soviet SAM site in Afghanistan. The mission was not about inflicting mass casualties, it was about delivering a psychological and technological shock. It was to prove that no Soviet asset in Afghanistan was safe, and to force a fundamental change in their most secure behavior. This plan existed at the nexus of shadow warfare. It involved the CIA's Directorate of Operations, the Navy's secretive Iron Hand SEAD community, and required the tacit or active agreement of elements within the Pakistani military. Its goal was to extend the same brutal logic the Stinger had applied to low-altitude attack aircraft to the high-tech realm of air defense itself. If the Stinger had made the skies dangerous for Soviet pilots, the harm would make the ground dangerous for their protectors. It was an escalation in the quality of violence, a move to dismantle, piece by electronic piece, the technological confidence of a superpower. Thus, by mid-1987, two parallel revolutions were underway in the Afghan theatre. In the valleys, the Stinger was democratizing air defense, putting it in the hands of a single fighter on a mountain ridge. Covert planning, a weapon was being prepared to perform a surgical strike at the pinnacle of Soviet military technology. The target was not a bridge or a garrison, but a principle, the principle of sanctuary. The first shot in this silent war was about to be fired, not from a mujahid's shoulder, but from the underbelly of a ghost plane, rewriting the rules of engagement in a blaze of anti-radiation fury. For the crew of a Soviet SA-6 gainful battery stationed on a barren plateau overlooking Bagram, the war was a paradox of monotony and latent terror. They were not frontline soldati grinding through mountain passes in BMPs. They were specialists, technicians. Their world was defined by cables, oscilloscopes, and the steady rotating sweep of the 1S-91 straight flush radar vehicle. Their uniform was often just grimy coveralls, their home a dust-choked tent or a modified shipping container beside the launchers. Their enemy was not the bearded mujahid in the distance, but the abrasive dust that choked filters, the searing heat that warped circuitry, and the biting cold that drained batteries. Their primary duty was maintenance, the endless, meticulous battle against entropy in a hostile environment. Psychologically, they occupied a unique space. They held immense power. Their 3 missiles could engage targets from low altitude out to nearly 15 miles, yet they were utterly static, tied to their precious radiating equipment. They were hunters, but tethered to a single spot on the map, a spot that, in their doctrine, was supposed to be a sanctuary. The radar's active pulse, sent out into the ether, was an act of dominance. It said, "We see, we control." For years, that confidence was unshaken. The blips on their screen were either friendly transponders from returning Hind groups or, very rarely, anomalies quickly dismissed as birds or atmospheric clutter. The war for them was a distant rumble, a column of smoke on the horizon. Their greatest fear was a ground attack by Mujahideen infiltration teams, hence the rings of machine gun posts and razor wire around their site. The sky was their domain and it was secure. This bred a specific, vulnerable mindset. Vigilance against electronic threats was minimal. Why practice radar shutdown drills when the only emissions were your own and those of friendly sites? The concept of an anti-radiation missile was theoretical, a spectre from the NATO front in Europe, discussed in advanced training but never relevant to the simple counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. Their drills were for engagement sequences: acquisition, lock-on, launch. The idea of a weapon that punished you for the very act of looking was a perversion of the combat logic they understood. The crew's identity was built around their machine's active search. To shut it down was to become blind, to abdicate their purpose. This made the order to power down in the face of a harm's scream not just a tactical move, but a profound psychological rupture, an admission that their primary sense had become a mortal weakness. The clash in Afghanistan was at its electronic core a collision between two opposing doctrines of the air dimension. The Soviet approach was defensive and area-oriented. Their air defense network in Afghanistan was an export model of their continental strategy: create layered, mutually supporting zones of denial. In a European war, these zones would bleed NATO's air forces dry. In Afghanistan, transplanted to protect fixed points, it became a static shield. Its strength was its integration and its ability to control a volume of airspace. But its critical weakness was its predictability and its emissions signature. It was designed to defeat aircraft, not to hide from missiles that hunted its own radars. It was a fortress, and fortresses announced their presence. A doctrine of siege, suppression of enemy air defenses. SEAD is not about static defense, it is about aggressive, offensive counter-electronics. Its core tenet is that an enemy's air defense is a system, a kill chain of detection, identification, tracking, and engagement. SEAD seeks to break that chain at its most vulnerable links, the sensors and the command nodes. The harm was the purest expression of this philosophy. It automated the hunt. It turned the defender's first and most crucial step, detection via radar, into the attacker's weapon. SEAD is a game of predatory patience. It waits for the enemy to turn on his flashlight in a dark room, and then it shoots him through the hand holding it. The strategic stakes of introducing SEAD to Afghanistan were immense. It was a low-risk, high-reward experiment. They could test a premier secret weapon in a real-world, non-nuclear conflict against their primary adversary's technology with full deniability. They could validate the harm's performance against actual Soviet radar types, collecting priceless data on seeker head efficiency, countermeasures, and kill probability. For the Soviet High Command, however, a successful SEAD strike was a strategic alarm bell. It meant their entire air defense paradigm, the very system that protected their most valuable assets in theater, was penetrable. It wasn't just the loss of a radar truck, it was the breaching of a conceptual wall. If a harm could hit a site at Bagram, then in a theoretical European war, harms could decapitate their forward air defenses in the first hours of conflict, opening corridors for NATO strike packages. Afghanistan was no longer just a counterinsurgency, it had become a live-fire proving ground for the opening act of World War III. The AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missile was not merely a new weapon, it was a new form of warfare. Physically, it was a 14-foot-long, 800-pound cylinder of high-explosive fragmentation fury, powered by a solid-fuel rocket motor. But its true lethality was in its mind, the broadband passive seeker head in its nose cone. Unlike a conventional missile that homes in on reflected radar energy bounced off a target, the harm listens. Its seeker is a library of electronic signatures, the unique pulse patterns, frequencies and scan patterns of known enemy radars. From the Soviet fan song of an SA-2 to the flap lid of an SA-10, and crucially the straight flush of the SA-6 and land roll of the SA-8, its digital memory could recognize them all. Once launched, the missile's logic was brutally simple. It would fly a pre-programmed course towards the suspected threat area. Upon detecting a matching radar emission, it would lock onto it. The connection made was one-way and unbreakable by traditional Soviet countermeasures. Jamming was difficult. The harm seeker was designed to cut through noise. Shutting down the radar was the only defense, but the harm possessed a memory mode. If the target radar went silent, the missile would continue to its last known location, using its own inertial guidance and detonate its 145-pound warhead in a lethal spray of tungsten cubes precisely where the radar should be. It punished hesitation and punished action equally. For the radar operator, the options were a horrific dilemma. Stay active and guide the harm directly to your position, or shut down and blind your entire battery, rendering it useless while the missile still might kill you. It was a checkmate in microseconds. The weapon required a delivery platform just as clandestine. Navy's A-6E Intruder, a twin-engine, all-weather attack jet renowned for its payload and avionics. For this mission, specific aircraft were covertly modified. All national and squadron markings were removed. The paint was a non-standard neutral tone. IFF, identification friend or foe, transponders were altered or disabled. S-carrier, but likely from a secure remote airfield with the tacit cooperation of Pakistani intelligence. The crew for such a mission were volunteers from the Navy's most trusted SE-8 and electronic warfare squadrons, operating under non-official cover. Their flight plan was a masterpiece of deniable penetration. They would fly nap of the Earth, using terrain masking to avoid Soviet and DRA radar, crossing the border at a pre-arranged, unguarded point. They carried no other ordnance but the harm. Their mission was not to dogfight or engage in a prolonged battle. It was to pop up at a designated coordinates, acquire the radiating signature of the target SAM site, fire the missile, and immediately turn and egress at maximum speed, disappearing back into the mountainous landscape. Success was measured in a single flash on a hillside and the permanent silence of a Soviet radar frequency. It was a sniper's mission executed with a supersonic bullet, with the geopolitical stakes of the Cold War resting on the crew's skill and anonymity. National security apparatus. It required a presidential finding, a secret order from President Reagan to the CIA, permitting the lethal operation. The debates were fierce. Proponents, including hardliners like CIA Director William Casey and key figures in the Pentagon, argued it was a logical, deniable escalation to break Soviet confidence and accelerate their withdrawal. Aircrew was captured. They worried about technology transfer if a dud missile was recovered. In Moscow, the leadership was initially oblivious to the specific threat, but deeply concerned about the erosion of their military position from the Stinger. Decisions were reactive, focused on tactical adaptations like adding IR suppressors to helicopters and changing flight profiles. The Soviet High Command's mindset was one of gradual degradation, not the possibility of a sudden, catastrophic technological leap from their enemy. The secrecy of the HARM program was its shield. The shock, when it came, would not be preceded by warning or diplomatic démarche. It would be a bolt from the blue, a fact delivered in shattered metal, forcing the Politburo and the General Staff to confront a vulnerability their intelligence services had failed to foresee. For the Soviet soldier manning the straight flush radar, the engagement with a HARM was a uniquely modern form of terror. It was impersonal, absolute, and rooted in his own expertise. He was trained to be the eye of the battery. In the final seconds, as the warning receiver screamed its unique, hopeless alarm, he understood with chilling clarity that his skill, his ability to operate the radar, had been weaponized against him and his comrades. The feeling was not of combat, but of predation. There was no enemy aircraft to see and shoot at, no muzzle flash to suppress. The agent of their destruction was an unthinking, uncaring algorithm following the electronic trail they had laid down. This induced a profound psychological shift, a corrosion of confidence that spread from the targeted site to the entire air defense network. The sanctuary was poisoned. Every time a radar operator powered up his set, a sliver of doubt would enter his mind. Was he illuminating a target, or was he painting a bullseye on his own forehead? The weapon enforced a paranoid discipline: emit only when absolutely necessary and for the shortest time possible. This self-imposed blindness degraded the entire integrated system, creating windows of vulnerability. The HARM's greatest impact was not necessarily the hardware it destroyed, but the freedom of action it denied. It turned the act of perception into an act of profound, life-threatening risk. Late summer 1987. A secure location, Southwest Asia. The mission package was codenamed Sterile and buried in layers of need-to-know security. S-Base, a team of technicians in unmarked coveralls, performed the final arming procedures. The AGM-88 HARM, suspended beneath the wing of the matte grey A6E Intruder, looked innocuous, a sleek, soulless tube. Its seeker head, however, was alive with loaded data. The target's electronic fingerprint, the specific pulse repetition frequency, and scan pattern of the SA-6 straight flush radar at a site guarding the eastern approaches to Bagram had been meticulously recorded by CIA ELINT, electronic intelligence assets, likely from a modified reconnaissance aircraft or a remote sensor. This was not a target of opportunity, it was a premeditated surgical strike against a known component of the Soviet shield. S-Navy aviators were briefed in a windowless room. Maps were photographic without markings. Coordinates were given as grids. Their flight profile was a study in clandestine penetration, a low-altitude ingress following the contours of the Hindu Kush, staying well clear of known Soviet early warning radar coverage using the mountains themselves as a radar shadow. Their window of execution was narrow, dictated by the predictable Soviet air defense readiness cycle. They would have one chance to pop up, acquire, and launch. There would be no second pass. The rules of engagement were absolute. If the target radar was not active, they would not fire. The weapon was too valuable, and the risk of a dud missile revealing its technology was too great. They were to be ghosts, unseen, unheard until the moment of detonation. As dusk settled, the Intruder, call sign Dark Star, taxied from the hangar. It carried no navigation lights. Its engine start was a muffled roar quickly swallowed by the desert night. The pilots, their helmets devoid of unit patches, went through the silent ritual of cockpit checks. The HARM systems were brought online, its seeker primed to listen for one specific electronic song in the static of the Afghan night. Takeoff was smooth, the aircraft climbing just enough to clear the perimeter before descending into the black troughs of the landscape. In the cockpit, the world was a green-tinted representation on the terrain-following radar screen, mountains rising like spectres to be skimmed over. The only sound was the rumble of engines and the calm, clipped exchange of flight data between pilot and bombardier/navigator. They were crossing a border without crossing it, violating an airspace without declaring war. The Cold War had found its perfect, covert instrument over eastern Afghanistan. The flight was an hour of sustained tension, a ballet of precision flying against a canvas of rock and darkness. Soviet IL-76 transports and MiG-21 patrols operated at altitude, unaware of the shadow passing beneath their electronic horizon. The target site, designated Sector Baker, was known to be a disciplined professional battery. Its radar activation times for evening sector scans were predictable. Dark Star approached from the south, the massive bulk of the mountains shielding its approach. At a pre-calculated point, the pilot eased back on the stick. The intruder climbed, a dark silhouette against the star-flecked sky, exposing itself for the first and only time. In the back seat, the bombardier/navigator's hands moved across the weapons panel. The harmed seeker, now free of ground clutter, began its hungry search. The electronic warfare display painted the ether, a cacophony of civilian radio, distant Soviet communications, and the faint, constant hum of the Afghan night. Then a familiar strobe pulsed into existence on the screen, a sharp, coherent signal. It was sweeping its sector, dutiful, confident, radiating its presence into the universe. The system automatically classified it. A targeting bracket locked around the signal on the screen. The pilot stabilized the aircraft. System agrees. The bombardier's finger hovered over the commit button. This was the threshold. Once crossed, there was no recall, no abort. The missile would fly its own war. He took a final scan of the parameters. Everything was nominal. The target was radiating. The missile was ready. The aircraft was in envelope. Dark Star rifle. He pressed the button. A hollow thump whoosh shuddered through the airframe as the harm was ejected from its rail. For a split second it fell, then its rocket motor ignited with a searing, white-hot fury that lit up the entire cockpit and the mountain face below. The missile accelerated with vicious intent, transforming from a launched object to a streak of malevolent light, arcing up and then nose down towards the source of the signal, 100 miles away in mere seconds. The intruder, its job done, immediately rolled hard and dove back into the terrain, throttles at maximum military power, running for the border. Behind it, it left not a trail, but a verdict, written in propellant and guided by the enemy's own pride. Sector Baker SA-6 site. Bagram approaches. The sequence of events at the target was a compression of confusion, realization and annihilation into a span of less than 30 seconds. Inside the straight flush radar vehicle, the operator saw the new high-speed contact appear on the edge of his screen. His training kicked in. Hostile aircraft? A missile? But its flight profile was all wrong. It was diving towards his location from a high angle, not flying level. Before he could even report, the RWR, radar warning receiver in the command vehicle, erupted with its unique, piercing tone for high-priority anti-radiation missile launch. The system identified the seeker type, an unknown Western designation. The battery commander's voice, laced with a panic he'd never heard in drills, screamed over the intercom, "Jasno! Wykluczyć radiolokację! Clear shutdown radar!" The radar operator slammed the master power switch to off. The humming console died. The glowing screens went black, plunging the compartment into sudden red-lit darkness. An oppressive silence fell, broken only by the ragged breathing of the crew. The logic was missile guides on radiation. No radiation, no guidance. They had performed the drill. They waited, hearts hammering against ribs for the sound of the missile passing overhead, confused, plunging harmlessly into the mountainside beyond. But the harm did not pass. It had already memorized the radar's last known coordinates. Its inertial guidance system, a sophisticated mechanical brain, had taken over the moment the signal ceased. It made minor, fin-adjusting corrections as it descended, a predator following a cold scent. To the Soviet soldiers who tumbled out of their vehicles and dove into shallow trenches, the first thing they saw was not a plane, but a silent, fast-moving star falling directly out of the zenith. No engine scream, just the sinister whisper of superheated air over its body. It was coming right for them. The impact was cataclysmic. The harm's warbody did not detonate on contact. It used a delayed fuse, allowing the missile to penetrate. It struck the Earth a mere 10 meters from the straight flush radar vehicle and burrowed slightly before the fuse triggered the 145-pound high-explosive blast fragmentation charge. The explosion was a contained, directed hell. A thunderclap of orange and white flame geysered into the night. The concussion wave flattened men and equipment in a 50-meter radius. But the true horror was the shrapnel. The warbody was designed to fragment into thousands of preformed tungsten cubes, each roughly the size of a child's die, traveling at velocities exceeding 4,000 feet per second. This cloud of super-dense metal scythed through the air with indiscriminate fury. The straight flush vehicle was not simply destroyed, it was eviscerated. Its aluminum armor offered no resistance. The radar dish was shredded into twisted scrap. The cabin was punctured by hundreds of cubes, annihilating the delicate circuitry and killing the operator instantly. The adjacent ZIL-131 transport trucks were turned into sieves. One of the SA-6 launch vehicles, its missiles still loaded, was raked by the cloud. Fuel and hydraulic lines were severed, sparking secondary fires that licked at the explosive warheads, forcing a frantic evacuation of the entire position. Shrapnel peppered the command post, cutting down the battery commander as he tried to rally his men. It was a sanitized summary of a localized apocalypse. In the aftermath, the silence returned, now filled with the crackle of flames, the hiss of escaping fluids, and the agonized shouts of the wounded. The site's defensive machine guns pointed uselessly at the sky. There was no enemy to shoot at. The attack had come from the void, guided by their own light. The shield had not been breached, it had been turned inward upon itself. The crew of neighboring SAM sites, witnessing the flash and hearing the detonation, felt a cold dread seep into their bones. They had just seen the fundamental contract of their service broken. They were no longer hunters in a secure blind. They were bait, and something new and terrible was fishing in their pond. The Dark Star intruder was already 50 miles away, fading into the radar shadow of the mountains. Its pilots did not see the explosion. They monitored their electronic support measures suite. At the precise calculated time of impact, the distinct pulsing strobe of the straight flush radar on their screen vanished. Not a shift, not a move to a backup frequency, a total, permanent electronic silence. The bombardier/navigator keyed his mic, his voice flat, professional. Splash, Sector Baker. The mission was a technical success, but the real victory was not on their tapes or in their report. It was in the forced, permanent change they had just implanted in the mind of the Soviet 40th Army's Air Defense Command. The sanctuary was irrevocably contaminated. From this night forward, every radar pulse in Afghanistan would be laced with hesitation, every activation a calculated risk. The turning point was not a battle for a valley or a city. It was the moment a Soviet soldier learned that his most powerful sense could be the instrument of his own death. The shockwave from the harm strike propagated through the Soviet air defense network in Afghanistan faster than any official report. Within hours, through scrambled radio calls and the stunned debriefs of survivors, every SAM battery commander in theatre knew a site had been obliterated by a weapon that hunted radars. The immediate tactical consequence was a paralyzing caution. Standing orders were amended, then re-amended. Radars were to be activated only for the minimum time necessary to confirm a launch solution against a confirmed hostile target. The search function, the constant sweeping pulse that defined their control of the airspace, was severely curtailed. Spontaneous, opportunistic engagements became almost impossible. The integrated bubble of coverage over key bases began to develop gaps, transient but predictable windows of blindness. This directly degraded the effectiveness of Soviet attack aviation. The Su-25 Frogfoot pilots and Mi-24 Hind crews, already strained by the Stinger threat, now faced a new vulnerability during their most critical phases: takeoff and landing. The SAM shield over their home bases was flickering. A Mujahideen mortar team or a lone infiltrator with a recoilless rifle now had a higher chance of launching a surprise attack on the flight line during a radar-silent period. More critically, the procedural delay in radar activation meant that if a Stinger-armed team managed to get within range of the airfield perimeter, the response time for the air defense battery to acquire, lock, and fire was dangerously extended. The psychological safety net had been torn. Operationally, the Soviet High Command was forced into a costly and reactive adaptation. They initiated a crash program to deploy and modify electronic warfare assets. Truck-mounted bell and bucket jamming systems designed for the European theatre were hastily flown in. Their role was not just to jam Mujahideen communications, but to attempt to spoof or dazzle the seeker heads of anti-radiation missiles. The effectiveness of these measures against the sophisticated harm was questionable, but their deployment signaled a desperate shift in priorities. Resources were diverted from offensive operations to defensive technological countermeasures. The logistical burden increased. Furthermore, SAM site deployments changed. The classic textbook positioning for optimal radar coverage was now recognized as a liability. Sites were moved more frequently, often to less tactically advantageous positions that offered better physical concealment or terrain masking from predicted harm launch axes. This constant displacement degraded system calibration and unit cohesion. The very mobility that was the SA-6's and SA-8's strength was now being used in a fearful game of hide and seek rather than one of aggressive area denial. The initiative had been seized by an unseen enemy. Soviet air defense, once a static fortress, was now a nervous, shifting garrison, draining morale and combat efficiency with every move. In Moscow, the initial reports from the 40th Army were met with skepticism, then alarm. The General Staff's primary concern was not the loss of a single radar vehicle in Afghanistan. It was the capability the strike represented. GRU, military intelligence, and KGB residencies were tasked with a single, urgent objective: identify the weapon and its delivery method. Fragments of tungsten cube shrapnel were collected from the strike site and flown back to the USSR for analysis. The unique pattern confirmed it was not from any known bomb or artillery round. The damage profile pointed to a specialized anti-radiation missile. The search for the launch platform was fraught. No Soviet pilot or ground observer had reported seeing an attack aircraft. Satellite reconnaissance showed no unusual NATO aircraft deployments in the region, but the shadow of suspicion fell heavily on Pakistan. The Soviets now had to consider two nightmare scenarios, both born in the same strike. First, that the United States had provided the Mujahideen with a rudimentary, ground-launched anti-radiation weapon, a possibility that threatened every radar site along the border. S was itself conducting clandestine SEAD missions with carrier or land-based aircraft, a direct and escalatory act of war. This intelligence crisis forced a fundamental reassessment of the war's covert dimensions. The rules of the proxy conflict, which had allowed for the supply of stingers, had been violently expanded. The Soviet response was a mixture of fury and grim realization. Direct action without revealing their own vulnerability. They were trapped in a deniable warfare paradox, their technological superiority punctured by a weapon they could not acknowledge facing from an enemy they could not officially name. The long-term strategic consequences of the harm strikes and the demonstrated vulnerability they exposed rippled far beyond the Hindu Kush. Within the Soviet military-industrial complex, the event was a seismic shock. With invaluable validation data, but for the USSR, it was a terrifying preview. War games for the European theatre had to be recalibrated. The assumption that their dense, layered air defense networks could survive the opening hours of a NATO air offensive and continue to function was now in serious doubt. The development of next-generation Soviet SAM systems like the S-300 was accelerated, with a renewed emphasis on mobility, shoot-and-scoot tactics, and passive detection methods to counter the anti-radiation threat. Afghanistan had become a brutal, real-world test lab, and their equipment had failed a key exam. For the Soviet soldier and officer in Afghanistan, the cumulative effect of the stinger and the shadow of the harm bred a deep-seated cynicism and a sense of technological inferiority. The war was no longer a counterinsurgency, it was a testing ground for Western weapon systems, and they were the targets. Morale, already declining, suffered a critical blow. Letters home and veteran testimonies began to reflect a new theme: the feeling of being experimental subjects in a conflict their leadership could not win, and for which they were not equipped. The limited contingent was facing unlimited technological escalation. Politically, the strikes contributed to the hardening of sentiment within the Politburo that the war was unsustainable. General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, already seeking perestroika and glasnost, saw Afghanistan as a bleeding wound draining resources and international goodwill. The harm incidents, though highly classified, fed into the military's own grim assessments presented to the leadership. It was one more data point proving that the costs of continued occupation were escalating exponentially, while the prospects of a military victory were vanishing. The decision to withdraw, formally announced in April 1988 with the signing of the Geneva Accords, was driven by a complex web of factors. But the undeniable degradation of what was supposed to be their one unassailable advantage, air power and its defense, removed a key pillar of the argument for staying. If they could not secure their own skies, they could not secure the country. While the exact number of HARM missiles fired in Afghanistan remains classified, the impact is verifiable through observable changes in Soviet behavior and post-war analysis. Intelligence estimates noted a marked decrease in the operational tempo and confidence of Soviet air defense radars in the final 18 months of the war. Lost statistics for Soviet aircraft, while dominated by Stinger kills, show that their ability to provide effective, responsive close air support continued to erode, partly due to the degraded and hesitant air defense umbrella over their own bases. The true legacy of the HARM in Afghanistan was doctrinal, not statistical. It proved the devastating efficacy of standoff precision CEA in a real-world conflict, air power doctrine, for decades to come. The lessons learned were directly applied with overwhelming effect just a few years later in the 1991 Gulf War, where the opening moments of the air campaign saw a torrent of HARMs and other SEAD assets dismantling Iraq's Soviet-modelled air defense system, which was far more static and less sophisticated than what the USSR had deployed in Afghanistan. For the Mujahideen, the direct tactical benefit of the HARM strike was minimal. They didn't capture the terrain. But the strategic effect was profound. It deepened the fissure between Soviet ground forces and their air cover, making convoys more vulnerable and outposts more isolated. It was a silent partner to the Stinger, attacking the system that enabled the Stinger's targets to operate. Together they formed a pincer movement in the electromagnetic spectrum and the physical sky, strangling Soviet operational freedom. The final grim verification came in the aftermath of the Soviet withdrawal in 1989. Abandoned SAM sites showed evidence of hasty dismantling and destruction of sensitive equipment, but also of altered, less effective positioning. And in the wreckage of one site near Bagram, investigators would later identify among the generic shrapnel the distinctive cube-shaped fragmentation patterns that were the AGM-88's silent, metallic signature, a ghost in the machine of a lost war. The story of the HARM in Afghanistan is not one of a decisive battle, but of a decisive silence. It is the story of a weapon that fought a war of perception, waged not over dirt and rock, but over confidence and doctrine. Its target was never just a radar dish or a ZIL-131 truck. It was the psychological foundation of a military superpower's technological assurance. In the mountains of Afghanistan, a conflict defined by ancient methods of tribal warfare became the unlikely crucible for a form of combat that would define the future. The contest for control of the invisible landscape of electrons and information. The Soviet SAM crewman, trained to be the vigilant eye of an all-seeing system, was forced to learn a terrifying new vulnerability. His expertise became his liability. The very act of performing his duty, of reaching out with his radar to see the enemy, could now summon a retaliation that was swift, absolute, and utterly impersonal. This shift from hunter to hunted, enacted in a few seconds of shrieking alarm and tungsten rain, represents a fundamental transition in the nature of warfare. It marked the point where sanctuary became a function of emission control, where survival depended not on armor or fortification, but on the discipline of electronic silence. For the United States, the covert use of the HARM was a perfect, deniable experiment. It provided incontrovertible proof of concept for a weapon system that would become a pillar of American air dominance. The data gathered from those secret missions over the Hindu Kush informed tactics, improved seeker algorithms, and cemented the doctrine that, to control the air, one must first blind the enemy's gaze. The success was so complete that it rendered the weapon's future use almost mundane. In subsequent conflicts, the HARM would become a standard opener, its shock value replaced by expected efficacy. In the broader sweep of the Cold War, this silent front was perhaps its purest expression. A conflict where the most significant blows could be delivered without a formal declaration of war, where the most valuable outcomes were measured in altered behaviors and compromised paradigms rather than captured territory. The HARM strike did not win the Soviet-Afghan War, but it, along with the Stinger, systematically dismantled the pillars of Soviet military power in theatre, proving that their vast mechanized might could be unpicked by precision and patience. The legacy echoes in every modern conflict where air power is contested. It lives in the frantic drill of a radar crew practicing emergency shutdowns, in the constant dance of emission management, and in the understanding that in today's battle space, to be seen is to be at risk of being killed by a weapon that remembers where you were, even after you choose to hide. Afghanistan 1987 was where that future arrived, not with the thunder of an army, but with the whisper of a missile following a dying pulse into the dark, rewriting the rules of sanctuary forever.